Okay, welcome to another edition of No Nonsense. And yes, we're going to be talking about Bill C-10. And here is some language you don't often hear at a parliamentary committee. It appears Canada is not immune to the growing trend of government intervention to curtail freedom and to seek to control parts of the internet's infrastructure in ways that are reminiscent of actions taken by authoritarian governments. I'm not kidding. This is a petition that was sent to government regarding this particular bill, which many people, including me, believe is a serious threat to curtailment of free speech. Peter Menzies is the former vice chairman of the CRTC, now a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for Public Policy. He runs Menzies Strategies, and he was, in an earlier life, the publisher and editor-in-chief at the Calgary Herald, and still keeps his hand in by contributing to many Canadian newspapers, writing on the impact of the internet on society and media and cultural policy, which is, of course, right at the heart of Bill C-10. Welcome, Peter. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thanks very much. I'm happy to be here.
It's very troubling to see this. It happens with legislation from time to time, that you have a badly written piece of legislation, even with bad intent, and then we try to fix it by putting 100 band-aids on it, when really what needs to happen is to go back to the drawing board and rethink.
Yeah, absolutely with this one. I mean, it was time for Canada to take a good look at its communications legislation, both the Telecommunications Act and the Broadcasting Act. I mean, but trying to use the Broadcasting Act to capture the internet and issues on the internet was never a good idea. It's, you know, like, I think I used this phrase a couple of weeks ago, putting the CRTC in charge of the internet is like putting a logging company in charge of the Great Bear Rainforest. Yeah. Their purposes are entirely different, right? And that's nothing against the people at the CRTC. They're public servants. They follow what the legislation says, but they've got 30 years of history of doing things in a certain way. And trying to wrestle I mean, it's just trying to stuff the internet into the Broadcasting Act really turns Stephen Guilbeault into the most regressive heritage minister in the history of heritage ministry. You know, it's just such a
funny thing, isn't it? I mean, to use this, my understanding of this and listening to the proponents of this bill, it is essentially embraced by Quebec. The folks there looking for more cultural protections, more access to French language services, whether it's on Twitter or YouTube or Netflix, and that they've now come through this clumsy door to try and accomplish that. And as you say, using the Broadcasting changes the Broadcast Act, but also challenging free speech, freedom of expression, which seems
it absolutely does. I mean, because I mean, this isn't a radical point of view. Those, you know, the proponents of C-10 try to paint those opposed to it as somehow kooky, but the list of people who are objecting to this, you know, includes civil rights associations, people, you know, esteemed academics such as Michael Geist and Emily Laidlaw at the University of Calgary, and you know, a former CRTC chair, Conrad von Finkenstein, and two other former CRTC commissioners,
yourself,
right? And myself, and many more. I mean, and there's a lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am who have looked at this and said, no, this engages speech. This engages the charter, right? And people don't get that because they don't understand that the CRTC, essentially since its beginning, has been about managing speech. That's kind of what it does.
That is the point. It's to make sure that there isn't offensive speech, or there's a right amount of a certain kind of speech, right? That's what the Canadian content rules are.
Well, exactly. And there's so many, you know, there's so much you know, what type of music you play and when you play it, how much news you broadcast and when you do it, how much Canadian content you do. You can't say any of George Carlin's 7 deadly words. You can say that that's all fine if you want,
Yeah.
But I mean, they've taken away licenses from radio stations that they thought behaved badly. All those sorts of things. I mean, it's what it does. I mean, the whole purpose of it was to say, if we're going to license you to use a public resource, which is radio waves, we are going to ask that you conduct yourself in a certain way. Fair enough, right? That's a fair trade. You're going into a willing arrangement between two parties. And it's like renting a home. If you're a landlord, you say to the tenants, here's the rules, and the tenants can say yes or no, right? The internet is not a publicly owned asset, right?
No, that's like saying you're trying to regulate space as
Right.
opposed to the airwaves that were part of that. Like, I think you had a good description of this, that it's sort of supply management. When you're talking about broadcasting television and radio, that is spectrum that does belong to the government of Canada, or that's who
Yeah, it's a
manages.
crown asset. Yeah.
But we're not talking about spectrum. We're talking about the infinite world of the internet.
Right. Yeah. And the spectrum is a finite resource, right? So the government was managing it, right? We give this much for commercial, this much for public. CBC gets this much.
Right.
Private gets this much. Commercial, community radio gets this much. Indigenous radio gets this much, right? And that's who you hand it up. But the internet, there's no exchange. There's no application for a license or that sort of stuff. It's not a crown asset, right? You're declaring sovereignty over something that there's really no evidence that you have sovereignty over it, other than no purpose, no reason, no rationale for doing it, other than saying that the internet is broadcasting, which is like saying that a cow is a caribou. I mean,
and also, I mean, there are laws. I mean, this is a global asset, right? I mean, it's a global forum. And for Canada to decide it's going to unilaterally insert itself and impose rules and restrictions, I can't imagine that the rest of the world is going to accept this. Never mind those of us who think it's a bad piece of legislation.
No, I mean, there's lots of things on the internet that justify some regulation, right? I mean, there's certain companies the situation in Canada where you have big streamers like Netflix, they take a lot of money out of the country and they don't pay any taxes or something like that. Right. I mean, you got to fix that, right?
Sure. But I don't think anybody disagrees with that. Right? If you want them to contribute to Canadian content, tax them, use the money.
Exactly. I mean, and if the filmmakers and that want money, just give them the money, right? I mean, go get it from these guys and give it to them. I mean, you can argue about that if you want, but that's a lot simpler than regulating the whole internet. And the essential thing is there's a difference between regulating the gatekeepers, which is, sort of a traditional, and now we're regulating the gate kept.
Yeah.
Right? And that's a huge difference.
You and me that are talking here on a podcast.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. On a podcast like that. Like, the CRTC might very well say at some point, okay, no, we don't want to regulate podcasts, right?
Yeah.
But they're the ones that are choosing, right? They're still, we're supposed to be grateful for that.
Yeah.
Right. That they have said, you have permission to speak, Senator Wallin.
Right. And this is not, I mean, I'm reading the words from committee last night, and our thanks, as you've already noted, to Michael Geist, who was following this like a dog with a bone and watching all of the committees. But what they agreed to last night, and excuse me, I'm going to read from the screen here, is that they are going to, just a minute, I've got to find it here. The original bill included an exemption for YouTube users that stated this act does not apply in respect of programs that are uploaded online, etc. There was a section that protected all of this, free speech, individual users, you and I talking to one another, all of that. And they took it out. They actually excised that from the bill. And what they've put in is something that says, we should really be concerned about freedom of expression, and put that in the back of your mind. It proposes an additional guarantee that might address the concerns of certain people, that many Canadians were alarmed by free speech. This would be by adding another layer of, it's just kind of gobbledygook. It's just, there's no guarantee.
Well, I mean, you can see how, when you get it, And we've all been in committee discussions, right? Where
Yeah.
you talk about things for a while and then you finally come up with something and you think, oh, this is good. We can
Yeah.
all agree on this. But then you wake up the next morning and go, oh, that didn't really say anything
Right.
because, you know, I mean, I appreciate the gesture in terms of that. And I appreciate that everybody agreed because that's an acknowledgement to me that they're aware that there's a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, 2 days ago, the Attorney General Lametti appeared
Yeah.
before that committee, and he didn't really dispute Geis and or the arguments of Geis and Laidlaw and that sort of stuff, or say, I mean, let's be clear that, I mean, a charter clearance by a government, I mean, and Stephen Harper found this out a lot,
Mhm.
doesn't mean it gets past the courts, right?
Correct.
It's not the government that decides what's charter compliant and what isn't.
Yeah.
It's the courts that make that decision. So this last night, I mean, it's just kind of funny. I mean, the idea that, you know, a group of parliamentarians feel that they have to insert into a piece of legislation that it should be charter compliant is,
Yeah.
you know, kind of wow, right?
Well,
I mean,
it's an
of course
acknowledgement
it
that
should
they
be.
think it isn't. Yeah.
Yes, it's an acknowledgement that they think it isn't. It's sort of like handing it over to the CRTC and saying,
Well, this
okay,
also,
here, take this, have fun with it. But if I'm at the CRTC, I'm like, oh my God, what have you done?
now let me just come back at you because you sat on the CRTC, and I'm just going to read the words of Ian Scott, the CEO of the CRTC
Yeah.
these days, who said back in March, and he was testifying at the same committee, kind of claimed a right to regulate all internet video. And I'm quoting him here: "We have regulation over all programming, and programming is very widely defined," said Scott. "The world has changed." Do you think the CRTC thinks it can regulate the internet?
Well, I mean, the CRTC about, I think it was 1999, when programming first began appearing on the internet, kind of claimed the turf, right? But then said, we're going to claim it, but we're not going to do anything about it. They called it a new media exemption order, right?
Okay.
And they said, basically, we're going to keep an eye on this, see if it causes a problem, but we're going to claim the turf. Now,
Just
there's
in
no
case.
evidence. There's no evidence that they were entitled to claim the turf.
Yes.
They just did, right?
Yeah.
And they were never challenged on it because they never tried to exert any authority over it, right? So while it's been the CRT's position that that's its turf, it did it initially for primarily to be able to monitor it, to watch it, to see if it had impact on things. And at least twice since, you know, that exemption orders come up for review.
Mhm.
And when I was there and we took a look at it and said, there is no problem here, right? That we need to intervene in, right? There's no need for the CRTC to intervene into this world. It's thriving. It's doing quite well. The current system seems to be doing fine, or, I mean, whatever you get used to is fine in that system, which is largely a failure, I think, in terms of the Canadian content on broadcasting. But yeah, that's the background on that. So that's
Okay.
probably what Ian was referring to.
And you've raised a couple of things here, and I want to come to that, whether the internet helps or hurts Canadian content or helps or hurts Canadian broadcasters, because it does give it a whole other venue for exposure. But Michael Geis was writing last night that and this is based on a memo that was, I guess, coming internally, because Minister Guilbeault's own bureaucrats have said, this is a really big problem. You can't go taking away freedom of speech. That would be a bad thing to do, because the government's list of sites and services targeted for Bill C-10 regulation includes any news sites, like if you were going to add the BBC or CPAC, podcast apps, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, audiobooks, Audible services, workout apps, sports streaming, niche video, pornography sites, of course. We've got laws to deal with hate and pornography and violence already. Do we need anything else?
I haven't seen the evidence for that. I mean, in many ways, Bill C-10 is a solution looking for a problem.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I get the existentialist angst in Quebec over French language, right?
Yeah.
That's always there. It's very easy to shout fire in that crowded theater and stampede the herd very quickly. And I'm not unsympathetic towards it, but there's ways you can address those issues without doing something this sweeping. If you're trying to, you very rarely cure something in particular by doing something in general.
Exactly.
And that's kind of the fault behind this. But I mean, the infinity of the internet, I mean, the very idea that you can get into content control over it is that's something that non-democratic states do.
Exactly. That would be what the only place we could look for guidance on how to control free speech would be, say, China, for example.
Yeah, Iran's a good example too.
Yeah.
but
in terms of what China has done with its own,
I mean, lots of countries do. I mean, that they block, particularly in the Middle East, porn websites and that sort of stuff are blocked, and that sort of stuff. So, I mean, it's done, but in general, it's not done in democratic states. And the I mean, the instances, we do have laws, right? We have libel laws, we have slander laws. If you say something, if you call me something horrible on Twitter, I can sue you.
Yeah.
Right. And, I mean, for about $300, I can probably get a lawyer's letter and squeeze a quick grand out of you and an apology on Twitter, and we can move along, right? And
there's some different rules for public persons because there have been some court cases on that, but essentially you have recourse.
Yes, yeah, you do. I mean, there's civil law and there's criminal law in the case of hate speech, right? So if somebody is violating the hate speech law online, the police will investigate and carry on. Child porn's been being, as soon as it's identified on the internet, been being taken down by ISPs for as long as it's been there. Now, you might want to update that to make it faster, if it's possible. But again, that's been managed under the current framework very efficiently for a very long time. So it's not like it's been floating out there and people have been accessing it through ISPs. Bad people will always find ways around things. But yes, there are laws in effect, and like I said, if you want to attack a particular problem, attack it in a particular fashion.
So in the US, where they have protection under the Federal Communications Commission, Section 230, where the Googles of the world and the Twitters of the world and the Facebooks of the world are not considered publishers in the same way that you were when you ran the Calgary Herald.
Right.
If you ran a story in the paper that was libelous or defamatory, you had to take responsibility. The big techs have had some exemption and protection from that. What should it look like if we want to put some constraint on it?
In terms of a regulation on what gets posted on Facebook,
or their level of responsibility. You, as editor of the Calgary Herald, you were
that's a tricky one. I mean, I mean, when you're the editor of a newspaper, you're responsible for what gets published because you curate everything that gets chosen. You're the gatekeeper, right?
Right.
At the same time, you vigorously defend your freedom to,
publish stories that annoy people.
Well, I'm going to be the only gatekeeper. Right, the government's not going to tell me what the rules are in terms of the gatekeeping. So, in general, I'm mostly inclined, and I'm open to a good argument on this, but I'm mostly inclined with the idea that the companies themselves will want to make sure the space they're providing for people is safe. Right. So there's enough motivation from your subscribers, yourself, and your users to keep the space safe. I mean, since Facebook launched, there were always rules. Okay, so you can take bathing suit pictures, but no nipples.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Male or female. Right.
Right.
in terms of photos. Right. And that sort of stuff, because they didn't want, porn being uploaded.
Yeah.
Or anything like that. So they drew lines there. So they always had rules. And I tend to think that in the long run, it's in their own best interest to keep those rules. And they will, companies, especially publicly traded companies, will always act in their own best interest, or be motivated to do so. Now,
and if I don't like what I see as a user, if I'm mad at all the junk I see on Twitter, I don't have to participate. I cannot be on Twitter if I choose.
that's right. Yeah, it's not. I mean, you can get into it with Facebook and some of these guys about, you know, whether there is an actual competitive alternative and competition bureaus and that sort of stuff. But in terms of their general behavior, yeah, I mean, I used to hear that from broadcasters all the time. You know, you'd get complaints from people saying, you know, that show was a little raunchy to be on at, you know, 7 o'clock. You know, what was it? Sex with Sue used to come on in the Western time zones a lot earlier than in the Eastern time zones, right?
We should reference this for people who might not have ever seen Sex with Sue, but she was quite a matronly, almost teacher-like person who would come on and really talk in very specific terms, not using cute little words to describe body parts, but the actual words. And it was an educational service. But you're right, it came on earlier out here where we live.
Yeah. So, but the response from broadcasters was always generally, and people actually generally accepted, if you don't like it, change the channel.
Yeah.
Right.
That's my view of it.
Because once you get into, like I said, there are certain laws that you will have. Speech in Canada isn't totally unfettered the way it is in the United States,
right?
In terms of that, and we all understand that. But in general, you just leave it alone and trust that people, you know, if you don't like what's on Netflix, you go to Disney Plus, or you go to Crave, or you go someplace else. The role of regulation should be to make sure that there are competitive alternatives. Right?
But that's the issue. That was the issue with Donald Trump and his followers, that, you know, they were kicked off Twitter and kicked off Facebook. But where do you go if there are no other venues that have been allowed? Parler was growing up, then Parler was shut down. How do we let other competitors, whether you agree with their basic content bias or not, to flourish in a world with these big tech giants?
Yeah, I mean, and especially as access isn't unrestricted, right? It's the internet and it's infinite. But after a while, you know, with Google, for instance, it gets so big, that it's the one. I mean, Parlay or Parler, or whatever, however you pronounce it. I mean,
that wasn't Parlay here,
but the government didn't kick it off. Google did, because it was acting in what it felt was its own best interests, and it was defining the public interest. And I'm not entirely comfortable with them doing that. I mean,
neither. No.
I mean, there's a long tradition in telecommunications, you know, called common carriage, where you don't interfere with, you know, what somebody has in their suitcase when they're hopping on the ferry. Doesn't, I mean, as long as it's legal, doesn't matter to you, right? You don't charge, you know, if you're charging $10 a pound for my suitcase to go on the ferry, you don't charge one person one rate and another person another rate, and you don't deny one person access just because you don't like them, right? So the idea of this sort of content net neutrality, I think C-10 and some of these other things has kind of brought that to the fore. Because previously everybody just talked about net neutrality in terms of, you know, when you're sending your service across through my network, I won't treat you any differently than anybody else. I won't, you know, if I have to restrict bandwidth, everybody gets restricted at the same time, right? But it was always technical, and now you're getting into content.
Yeah, this is the real. Okay, let me come back to a couple of things. So some of the cultural community and the production community are saying we need to impose these Canadian content rules that we've had here in Canada on all these services that come in. We want to see more CanCon or more FrenchCon or whatever it is. Is this the mechanism? I mean, there's got to be some sense of demand for that product and consumption of that product, i.e. viewers or eyeballs or whatever it is. Can we
Yeah,
manage?
I mean, I think they're in that situation. I think they think that way because that's the only way they can think. After, 40, 50 years in the CRTC managed system. And, I mean, there's a lot of good people in there, so I don't want anybody to take it personally, although some will. But essentially, the system is people have companies, independent production companies and others, not all of them, but their primary business model is to meet regulatory requirements, right? I'm going to create a company and I want to make some movies, and these are the movies I want to make. I'm going to find a TV station, a TV network that's going to put it on. And they're going to put it on not because they have to.
Yeah, and I'm going to find a producer that was born in Canada and an actor.
I'm going to meet the funding qualifications, right? Every now and then, there's something produces a hit out of that, yeah. Right? And I mean, film is a really risky business anyway, but for the most part, it's designed to meet regulatory requirements, right? And then when the requirements are met and the Canada Media Fund spends its 350, successfully collects and then spends its 350 or $400 million every year, the CRTC is happy, the filmmakers are, they're getting paid, right? They're making money for themselves and they're all happy. Nobody's seen the show.
Right. Right.
So it's not market-based, right? It can be successful without anybody watching it.
Yeah, you get anomalies, the Kim's Convenience or the Schitt's Creek or whatever, but there's hundreds of hours that nobody sees because they don't want to watch it.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, they're in a tough spot. I mean, there's some difficult things going on, like how cheap you can buy American programming versus the cost of creating Canadian programming and that sort of stuff. I'm not saying there's not a need for subsidy of some kind, but the incentives aren't right. And they aren't right for the broadcasting companies either, because they just take a look at it. I mean, the most recent thing I remember us doing at the CRTC was, okay, we're not going to say how many hours you have to do. We're just going to say you have to spend 30% of your revenue on it. Thinking that, okay, if you have to spend 30% of your revenue on Canadian content, that you might think about getting a return on that investment, right? And changing the incentives. Yeah. I don't think that's happened. My impression is they said, okay, that's the tax we pay, 30%, and away we go, right? They just pay it's like they pay the rent and nobody really cares, but you get into that. On the other hand, with YouTube, there's 160,000, that report I quoted in the article in the Toronto Star, 160,000 Canadians regularly uploading what you'd call programming onto YouTube. 40,000 of them have built audiences large enough so that they're starting to make some money. 25,000, there's the equivalent of 25,000 full-time jobs on that, right? I mean, and that's people like Lily Singh, Justin Bieber, Shawn Mendes, right? That sort of stuff. They've all gone out, and that system is basically, that's a risk and reward system. I'm going to put my podcast out or my program out, whether it's a cooking show, a makeup show, a how to do your nails show, a how to be a handyman woman, whatever, right? And if I can build an audience, hey, I might make a little money out of this, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a way better incentive, right? And the cool part about it, just to finish this off, is the old-fashioned thinking, and this is Broadcast Act thinking, is to build a wall around Canada.
Exactly.
Right? And sort of, I use it mockingly, build that wall, right? But that's what they're talking about, building, trying to maintain a wall around Canada. In the modern area, that wall is a prison.
Yeah.
It's keeping you in, right? If you're producing Anglophone or Francophone programming, the way you make money in Canada is Canada's a pretty small market. It's the size of California. And when 25% of it speaks French in the home, right? So you got a market of maybe 30 million. Right next door, there's 330 million of them, right? In India, there are 125 million Anglophones, right? There's Australia, there's New Zealand, there's South Africa, there's the UK, places you can sell them to, even without translation. Why would you build? I mean, I find that philosophically so difficult that, why would you be that
timid? Why would you be that afraid? Why wouldn't you just
Here's
go
my
out
product, love it or hate it, right?
go out and kick some ass, you know?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
and I mean, I get that some subsidy is required. I'm fine with that, but
Yeah.
this wall building stuff just,
Well,
it's,
that's the thing. I mean, that was my earlier question to you, really, which is, in fact, what the internet does, and even some of the services that people may be annoyed at, whether it's Facebook or whatever it is, actually amplifies and gives that audience to Canadian content. Why would we want to regulate away that ability to find a larger market?
yeah, it's strange because, and that's when you get into that discoverability argument that they're making,
Yeah.
which, I mean, people throw that word around and I'm not even sure what they're talking about, right? We need to make it discoverable.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done it. You go to Netflix, there's a little search tool up there, type in Canadian.
Yeah.
Boom. Right? All of a sudden you're
Exactly.
controlling you're getting Canadian content all the time, right? So, I mean, what are we talking about? Like, are we supposed to make the search tool, you know, should Canadian be the default term in the search tool? I
Right.
mean,
Not,
it's
I don't want that. I might sometimes want that to see what's, you know, a Canadian view of something particular. But I mean, this is where the problem comes, which is rather than having that discoverability and putting in some buzzwords so that if you and I are saying things that are critical of the government, because the minister has said this aloud. He actually said, we want to regulate content so that we can promote social cohesion, whatever the hell that is. And secondly, we want to stop political taunts that may be critical of government. So he's raised the specter, which is why everybody's reacting to it, is that they're going to put in CRTC and criticism, and up is going to come Pamela Wallin and Peter Menzies, right? And then they're going to be able to target us.
yeah, or they just leave us alone but favor other people.
Correct. Okay.
Make them
So
more
that's the
discoverable than
important
us,
issue.
right? I mean,
Yes.
that's the way you can try to finesse your way
Right.
through this. If that is truly your goal.
Yeah.
You know, if your goal is to deflate unpreferred speech and inflate preferred speech, that's the tool you can use, right? And when you're doing that, you are messing with people's speech rights.
Absolutely.
there's absolutely no question. So, I mean, and that's the tricky part that people get into there. And I'm really disappointed in the creative community that, I mean, they're always about rights and progressive issues and that sort of stuff. But when it comes to this, they've so flagrantly put what they believe to be their own self-interest in front of the interests of, you know, ordinary citizens, that I find it rather, I mean, it's just, I don't know, it's just really disappointing.
It's very concerning because they do have support, both financial and publicly. Canadians are very protective of our own creators. We brag. I lived in the States for 5 years. You can't imagine how we run around bragging about this comedian or that singer or this writer, you know.
Yeah.
We do that, and we try and put it out there. The BlackBerry was the same thing. You know, you were saying this was our invention, the only thing that worked during 9/11. You know, you say, yeah, that's a Canadian product. It's a question of confidence rather than seeking protection behind the apron.
Yeah, I mean, we're very proud of them. We want them to succeed. We fund them. These are not issues, right? In terms of that. So why are you being mean to us?
Yes, and taking away my free speech.
Let's think about ways that we can make this work without, like I said, there are ways to meet these goals, right? Like if it's the big web giants that you want to target, then do it.
Yeah, then
just
do.
right in there, like Conrad von Finkenstein and I wrote for the Globe and Mail a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
Just say, okay, this applies only to people who have more than $100 million a year revenue in Canada.
Yeah.
Boom. Okay. Yeah. That certainly takes me out of the picture, right? And I'm guessing you too, right?
But maybe not so much Google. Yeah.
But maybe not so much Google, maybe not so much Facebook, maybe not so much Netflix. Because if that's who you're after, then, like I said, if you think there's a particular problem, use a particular tool.
Yes,
right?
to get at the, and you could require the gatekeepers to be a little bit more transparent
Yes,
uh, about their algorithms and what their algorithms are designed to do, which is to direct you to their content or to direct you to political content that they agree with. We're seeing that in the US. There's
right.
a,
Or be able to opt out of them and just control
yeah,
yourself, right? I mean, Bill
yeah,
C-11 is trying to address some of that stuff, and the government seems to have completely lost interest in it.
yeah,
Those
talk
are the
about
issues
that for
that
a
should be
moment.
being addressed, right?
Yeah,
Privacy, data protection,
right.
all these sorts of things, right? Those are like very justifiable things that should be regulated and watched, particularly, and competitions issues with big
I mean,
companies.
these are big right now because we're worried about it in the banking sector and all
Mhm.
of that, the, data privacy, what's it being mined for? I mean, there were even stories this week about those of us who signed onto the COVID app now having our
Right.
data mined, like, really?
Well, I know even the census I just filled out wanted to know if I had memory issues, and I can't remember whether I filled it out or not. It's
Now, there were several questions about what was your gender at birth, your assigned gender at birth that I'm telling you, in rural Saskatchewan, it's kind of seems like an odd question, but anyway. So can we do anything about the algorithm bias? Let me put it that way, that you're going to get news politically that suits the owners of the big tech companies. They have a democratic bias, obviously, in the US. Their algorithms send you to their related businesses. Is there anything we can do about that, or you just have to say that's the world? Be aware, be knowledgeable, and deal.
Well, I mean, you can do either, but to a certain point, when people have too much market power, you have to be conscious of that. And I think there's lots of justification for legislation governing those sorts of things. I think some of those things might best be managed through international agreements, given the nature of some of these companies and how widespread they are. So that, I mean, I think the companies themselves are encouraging that point of view, because it's going to be a lot easier for them if there's the same set of rules in the United States as there are in Canada, as there are in the UK, as there are in France, and that sort of stuff. So those, and there are, I know, discussions going on with OECD and that sort of stuff to get those sorts of things done. But I don't see any reason why, in the meantime, Canada shouldn't take a look at that. There's always some risks when you're dealing with that with Canada, with an American-based company, that you're going to trip over a trade agreement.
Well, and with Europe as well. I mean, this digital services taxation issue is a big one for Europeans, Australians, Americans.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're tricky, but I think in terms of those sorts of issues, data protection, both domestically and internationally, I think those are virtuous issues that look out for the rights of citizens, and actually, in a sense, like it was saying it, then you're regulating the gatekeepers, not the gate kept, right? And you're looking out for, you're regulating companies and not individuals in that sense, and all of those things make sense. And that's one of the sad things about C-10 is here we're marching off with this, like, really, I mean, what's it for? What problem is it trying to solve when there's these other issues that we should be having grand debates about, and protecting people. Speech isn't the thing that's going to hurt us the most on the internet.
No, exactly. I want to talk a little bit about journalism, because it's a world that both you and I come from. And we've always had, or for many years, a public broadcaster, which operated with government funding, tax dollars. Now, as we see so many newspapers and other outlets struggling to compete and survive in a world with the internet, with an infinite number of sources of information there, we're seeing the government now subsidize media operations, which could be seen as a bit of a collar, maybe a collar with a choke rope on it, because if you're beholden to people who pay you, maybe you'll be more susceptible or even supportive of these kinds of restraints that the government is promoting.
Oh, of course you will.
right? Jen Gerson, we had a panel at McDonald Laurier Institute
Yeah, which I
a couple
listened
weeks
to.
ago.
It's great.
Jen
Yeah.
called it the golden leash.
Yes, exactly.
And people think it's going to be their salvation, but it actually, like I said, it's you think it's going to save you, but it actually imprisons you, right?
Yeah.
And you do it to yourself, right? I sat in on some discussions a few years ago when newspapers first started approaching government to this, and the public servants themselves were horrified by the idea that they'd be deciding who was a journalist and who wasn't. They were really
As
uncomfortable.
they should be.
As they should be, right? And they kind of sent the newspaper people away disappointed, right? And it's really sad to see the newspaper people coming and saying, with a begging bowl to government, right?
Yeah.
It's just wrong, right? I mean, it's a sad time for newspapers, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was a sad time for livery stables when the automobile was created, right?
Yes.
And the fact of the matter is, just because these organizations are struggling, I don't think it means the death of journalism. I mean, journalism is not a platform, right? It's something that occurs on platforms, right?
It's the content.
Newspapers thought radio would be the end of things, right?
And then they thought television would be the end of things.
And then radio thought television would be the end of things, and it wasn't. But the internet really was. Yeah. But it wasn't because it took away their news. It's because it took away their classified advertising. It's because it took a newspaper was, it's almost like saying like a network broadcaster, is defined by its news. I mean, that was part of it.
Yeah.
But it's an entertainment platform, right?
Yeah.
And newspapers were always more than news, right? They were about recipes and horoscopes. And I mean, the one thing, I mean, you could get lots of phone calls if on a Catherine Ford column back in the day.
Yes.
Right.
She was controversial.
Right. But screw up the horoscope and holy cow. Right.
And Landers.
Exactly. Run one of those 2 days in a row by mistake. Right. So it was more than just news. So, if the government were to create some legislation that were to help manage this issue, I would think the best thing to do, and I've argued this before, is if you're gonna try to address this issue, try to address it where you're incenting people to innovate and adapt, right? Yeah. It's the same thinking as we're talking about with Bill C-10, right? If people are having problems, help them adapt to the internet because it's not going away.
No,
right?
Exactly.
It's a significant invention as the printing press was in its day, right? Yeah. So help people adapt, find some ways to have transitionary funding, tax holidays, that sort of stuff. Keep the leash invisible and long because but be an incentive to help you transition, right?
No,
I think one that will help you stay where you are, because you're just going to be there forever, and you're just going to have small government funded newspapers. And the worst part about that is no matter how virtuous the people in the newsrooms are, they will not be seen to be fair. People will.
That's the problem. It doesn't matter whether they are or not. They're seen now to be beholden to government and therefore unable to be critical, small c, of the events and the activities they see.
Right. And I mean, journalists are always seeking transparency from government, and rightly so.
Right.
One of the things the internet has brought about is criticism of journalism that they didn't face quite so much before. Yeah. And that's hard, right? And that's a difficult transition for people to make as well. But the idea, I mean, in my day, I mean, I'm old enough to say back in my day.
Yes,
but
me too.
Honestly, I mean, 20 years ago, the idea that among newspaper publishers that you would take submit to any form of regulation or subsidy by a government. I mean, people tried this on after the Kent Commission, and it was to the barricades.
Yeah.
There is no friggin' way you guys are touching a hair on my head, right?
And then what happened is a lot of these organizations maybe didn't take the internet threat or presence seriously enough, and they didn't get ready for it.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, and you know, and if you'd wanted to defend something, you might have come in and said, "Hey, wait a second, we make $30 million a year off these classified ads, and this guy's giving it away for free.
Yeah,
That's anti-competitive behavior. Stop him."
Yeah.
Right.
Challenge them on that issue, not on. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, it's too late for that now.
Yeah, that horse is out of the barn.
But it should be, there's lots of people trying to innovate. There's lots of young journalists and olders. I don't know that anybody's found the answer yet.
Yeah.
But like Jen Gerson's The Line, the Substack people, there's there's all kinds of different things that people are trying on there.
There's good journalists on Substack, Glenn Greenwald from the US, and there's serious people.
Yeah, and I mean there's lots of publications, Narwhal, and and that sort of stuff, and some are on the left and some are on the right, and some are more niche, and some are environmental and some are energy and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Somebody will figure out how to aggregate that at some point, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
But let it, try to help people transition. Don't help people. I mean, obviously newspapers, I don't even know how they're still alive, but most of them that are publishing, to the extent that they have a press run at all, it's pretty small, right? The printed copy.
Yeah.
And it only really exists because they make some money off flyer delivery, right? Yeah. The display advertising is gone, right? So sure. Work on that, but it's the solution that they're coming up with aren't sensible, because you need to create something that provides the opportunity for a long-term self-sustaining funding.
And if government wants to put money into these operations rather than the direct subsidy, which gives them control, or at least perceived control and influence, do what they used to do. They bought ads in every small town local newspaper across the country. It was a form of subsidy, but it accomplished everybody's goal.
Yeah, they did that. I mean, the tricky part with doing it, that sort of thing today, again, is help people build websites. I mean, there's a lot of these small town, and I get the issue, like a lot of the weekly newspapers. I mean, I started my working life at a weekly newspaper on Vancouver Island, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, I know the life, but they were very important for the community, right? I mean, that's where you announce the births of your children, your daughter's wedding, the deaths of your parents, all those sorts of things. That's where you found out about everything going on in the community. But a lot of them have been really killed because the local little radio station created a website, right?
Well,
and all of a sudden, all that news you were waiting for a week to get, even though there's just one reporter in town, you can just go to the local website and get it.
Yeah.
So in that sense, radio did end up killing the newspaper.
Yes. Okay.
But the trick should be to help them, help them have a good community website.
Yeah, I've got a kind of a last question, and it looks as if this bill is going to pass. I mean, the Bloc Québécois is supporting it, the NDP is supporting it, the Liberals obviously have their numbers. They will probably have enough support in the Senate, although some of us will be resisting it. What happens if this goes through without that section 4.1 that they excised, that actually said, we are not going to come and limit your free speech as individuals? If that's not put back in, what do we do?
Well, assuming it gets past you and your colleagues in the Senate, without being sent back with amendments for further consideration and that sort of stuff, and it gets royal assent. The very sad part about it is that for an industry thinking it's trying to find prosperity, it's going to create years and years of regulatory uncertainty and chaos, because it will be immediately challenged in court.
Yeah.
And that could take years, right? It requires the CRTC to define what social media is, right? And I'm thinking if that was easy, somebody would have done it already.
Right? Yeah.
And that involves, as you know, as you CRTC, years of process just to start building the foundations for what they might do, right? And who they're going to exempt and who they're going to have, and they got to contact all these companies and get their financial information. I mean, this is going to, honestly, this is going to take the rest of the decade, right? And anytime you create uncertainty, you inhibit investment, right? The last 10 years in Canada were the best in the history for Canadian TV and film production. The industry grew from a $5 billion to a $9 billion industry, basically by letting the internet flourish, right? A lot of that money was foreign investment by Netflix and Disney Plus and others and that sort of stuff. And now you're going to, I mean, there's a real risk you're going to kill that goose. Because there prior to COVID anyway, there was a golden egg sitting there. There is lots of jobs, right? And even in Francophone production, even in film, and even in certified CanCon, the last 2 years, I mean, there were some wobbly years where people might get concerned, but they were their best years ever, right? So I don't think, I mean, if this goes through, like, I think it's killing the goose that laid the golden egg just by being bad. A bad
and
piece of
will be a
legislation.
pariah, as you say, internationally. People are going to say, I don't want to play by those rules. I'm not even going to try and operate in Canada or create.
Yeah, I'll go make my films in New Zealand.
Exactly.
Right?
Who wants
or Mexico you know, or someplace else, right? I'll just do that. And that's the really tragic part about it. Because by trying to do something they think is good, they're actually going to do harm. There's a very good chance they're going to do harm to the people they're trying to help. And there will be less jobs in the Canadian television and film production industry.
The only silver lining I see is that maybe we can have a serious conversation about free speech in this country too, and why it matters, because we don't have that conversation very often.
Well, you know, if this hasn't been enough, if the online, from what I hear about the online harms bill they have up their sleeve, then you're really going to have one.
No, well, I think that's exactly what the minister was alluding to with, you know, promoting social cohesion. And, you know, what does that mean? That you've got to, you know, publish treatises from crazy radical groups to, or ban them all? Like, there's, again, as you say, no definition on these things.
Well, and that's the tricky part. By turning so much of it over to the CRTC to define, you've put the CRTC in a very difficult position, and they will be very, very probably try to be very, very careful about this. And their procedures themselves, you know, just create, as soon as they make a decision, somebody's going to take it to federal court.
Yeah, you bet.
Right. And then after federal court, it's going to go to the Supreme Court. And this is just going to go on and on for years. So, I mean, the solution is, even if it passes, for somebody to come along and just, I mean, understand it's a mistake when you see it. Either write the proper order in council to fence it in quickly, which they could do right now. They could come up with a draft order in council that would do, like I said, okay, only for people $100 million over, right? And over. That would have a lot of discussion right there.
Well, this is where we began this conversation, that bad legislation gets written all of the time. And sometimes it's so bad, you need to start again, as opposed to just trying to fix it with an amendment here, an amendment there. You have to go back and say, we're doing all these different things. We got privacy over here. We want to do something, you know, get some more money out of the pockets of big tech to do this. Like, there's lots of things that people would agree to, and then find a mechanism to deliver that.
Yeah, there's only so much duct tape you can use.
It's really great to talk with you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for the opportunity, and have fun with this project when it gets to the Senate.
Yes, we will. We'll be calling on you then to come in and testify and do all of that. Thanks so much. Peter Menzies, former editor-in-chief and publisher of the Calgary Herald, spent 10 years on the CRTC, so he knows what he's talking about, and currently a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thanks for your time.
Bye-bye.
See you soon. That's it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.